After Milvian Bridge, Rome saw one emperor win a battle. But history saw something deeper begin. Constantine had defeated Maxentius, yet the future of the vast empire still remained fragile and unclear. The west was now under his control, but the east was divided between Licinius and Maximinus Daia. For Christians, the moment looked like rescue, but hope arrived with a new and dangerous question. Who was Constantine, a sincere believer? A powerful politician or a man still learning faith? The answer would not come through words, but through laws, wars, churches, and a new capital. His religious policy would change not only his century, but the church's path for many centuries. Some would see God's instrument. Others would see a ruler who brought the church dangerously near power. Before judging his legacy, we must watch the path by which he became the only emperor. This story begins with victory, but quickly becomes a struggle for the entire Roman world. Long before the famous battle, Constantine built his power far from Rome, in Gaul and Britain. He understood that before fighting for empire, he needed a secure base and loyal people. For more than 5 years, he strengthened the Rhine frontier, where barbarians remained a constant threat. A frozen river could become an invasion road, and Constantine would not let the frontier sleep. He protected the provinces from raids and gradually won the gratitude of many people in Gaul. His rule there seemed wise enough that subjects endured the weight of taxes and power. Thus Constantine gained a ruler's rare gift, taking much without destroying the people's loyalty. The frontier gave him not only security, but also a protector's reputation among Western subjects. That reputation would become a weapon when he decided to challenge Maxentius for Rome. The empire did not yet know that northern preparation would soon change its capital's fate. Yet success in Gaul did not turn Constantine into a perfect or gentle ruler. He loved luxury, greatness, and spectacles meant to display the power of authority for public display. In Trier, he built a grand palace, while nearby roads and public works were neglected. Even vineyards, vital for the local economy, suffered because the drainage system had failed. Constantine could guard a frontier, but that did not mean he always protected the weak. To keep the crowd's support, he arranged frequent and expensive spectacles in the circus. Barbarian captives were sacrificed for entertainment, and chroniclers spoke of the beasts growing tired. This world was brutal, and Constantine understood the language of fear, spectacle, and power. So his story cannot become a simple legend of a holy king or ordinary tyrant. Before us stands a man of contradictions, and those contradictions will reshape the church's future. Constantine did not rush blindly against rivals. He moved like a patient player through calculated patience. He chose one enemy after another and always guarded his flanks before the next move. The campaign against Maxentius looked sudden, but it had been prepared for many years. Even marching into Italy, Constantine used only 1/4 of his military resources, leaving reserves behind. The remaining forces stayed behind to protect Gaul from revolt or barbarian invasion under frontier pressure. In diplomacy, he also planned ahead, especially regarding Licinius, Maxentius's eastern neighbor, against the east. If Licinius used the campaign, he might seize part of Maxentius's territories first during the campaign. To close that danger, Constantine offered him his half-sister Constantia in marriage, securing his flank. Behind that marriage, there may also have been a secret agreement between future relatives. Only when Licinius was occupied with Maximinus Daia did Constantine begin his invasion of Italy. The victory at Milvian Bridge gave Constantine the western half of the empire, not the whole world. The east was still divided between Licinius and Maximinus Daia, in two dangerous contenders, each seeking dominance. In Milan, the meeting between Constantine and Licinius strengthened their alliance, at least outwardly. After that, Licinius directed his strength against their common rival, Maximinus Daia, toward open war. Maximinus was still near Byzantium when Licinius unexpectedly appeared with a smaller army near the Bosporus. Despite weaker numbers, Licinius won, while Maximinus fled and died shortly afterward, securing eastern power. Now the empire was divided between two men, joined by marriage and mutual distrust. Licinius held the lands east of Italy, including Egypt. Constantine held Italy, the west, and Africa. Many hoped the civil wars had finally ended and that family ties would bring peace. But the empire was too small for two rulers dreaming of all its power. For a time, both rivals consolidated their territories and prepared for the inevitable clash. The tension did not disappear. It only became deeper, quieter, and more dangerous beneath formal peace. Finally, conflict erupted over a conspiracy supposedly directed against Constantine himself inside imperial circles. The investigation pointed to a relative of Licinius who had fled into eastern territory. Constantine demanded his surrender for execution, but Licinius refused to fulfill that demand. Across disputed borders, soon Licinius declared war, although Constantine had already gained an important political advantage before Roman observers. Later Christian historians often placed all blame on Licinius and justified Constantine, serving Constantine's narrative. But the source shows a more complex picture. Constantine also wanted war with his relative. He managed to make his rival appear as the aggressor before the empire. With careful timing, Licinius was outmaneuvered, sued for peace, and surrendered most of his European territories. In the settlement, after the war came peace, but Constantine used it not for rest, but for consolidation. Instead of remaining permanently in the west, he shifted attention toward recently conquered regions. First, his headquarters stood in Sirmium and later in Sardica, now Sofia, near Licinius's border. Both locations allowed him to watch Licinius and strengthen control over the new territory. The truce lasted until 322, but each year made it more strained toward another war. The main reason remained the ambition of both rulers, each desiring full imperial supremacy. Even titles and honors for their sons became a source of suspicion inside imperial households. By the truce's end, politics gained another explosive question: religion. His relations turned toward religious conflict. Now a struggle for power could appear as a struggle for true faith inside both courts. And this new coloring would make the next conflict especially dangerous for future history. Licinius's story is more complex than later Christian writers often made it appear, than propaganda allowed. For several years after the Edict of Milan, he took no measures against Christians. One contemporary Christian writer even described his victory almost like Constantine's victory in Christian memory. But Christian communities in his territories were divided by internal disputes and conflicts beneath public order. When these disputes caused public disorder, Licinius used imperial power to restore peace through Roman authority. Some Christians felt wronged and began to see Constantine as their defender. From imperial overreach, they called him the emperor whom God loved, and they prayed for him against Eastern suspicion. For Licinius, who was not Christian, such prayers for a rival looked like treason. Then he acted against some Christians, and Constantine gained a useful image as defender. Thus, religious anxiety became a weapon in the final struggle between two emperors, between frightened rulers. In 322, Constantine entered Licinius's lands while pursuing barbarians who had crossed the Danube. Licinius interpreted this, rightly or wrongly, as an intentional provocation toward war inside disputed territory. He gathered troops at Adrianople, awaiting Constantine's army, which was somewhat smaller, under watchful standards. Chroniclers claimed Licinius feared the magical power of Constantine's banner, the labarum, among Constantine's enemies. He supposedly ordered soldiers not to look at the Christian sign or attack it directly. If true, such an order could have demoralized the army before battle even began. After a long and bloody battle, Constantine's smaller army still won the day. Near Adrianople's walls, Licinius fled to Byzantium, a city that would soon gain a completely new meaning. His wife, Constantia, went to her brother, asking that Licinius live if he abdicated. Constantine promised mercy, but Licinius was soon killed and the empire became his alone. From that moment, Constantine became sole master of the empire and ruled 13 more years. Compared with civil wars, this period brought rebuilding, construction, and relative prosperity across exhausted provinces. But political uneasiness remained, and the court stayed a place of constant fear beneath palace silence. People were condemned to death for real and supposed conspiracies against the emperor inside suspicious courts. Among the victims was his eldest son Crispus, who had commanded the fleet against Licinius. Constantine ordered his execution, and family victory turned into shadow inside his own house. Yet Constantine had not sought absolute power merely for personal pleasure or empty glory. Like Decius and Diocletian, he dreamed of restoring the ancient greatness of the Roman Empire. But where they sought renewal through paganism, he increasingly looked to Christianity for renewal instead, and that decision would lead him to his boldest project, creating a new Rome. In Old Rome, Constantine had many opponents, especially among the Senate's ancient aristocracy. Inside Rome's Senate, these men mourned the fading of old gods, privileges, and the familiar order under Christian pressure. Even before the final war with Licinius, Constantine had already clashed with senatorial interests. Now, as absolute ruler, he could move away from the old center of power. He wanted a city that would be impregnable, monumental and tied to his own name. Thus arose the plan for a new Rome, Constantine's city, the future Constantinople, through imperial ambition. This project was not merely construction, but a political break with the past, against Roman memory. It allowed Constantine to build a capital without the heavy weight of old pagan families. But the location had to be more than a beautiful gesture. It needed strategic precision, and Byzantium became the city where Europe, Asia, and future history met, beside the Bosporus. Probably during the war with Licinius, Constantine recognized Byzantium's strategic value. During Eastern War, the city stood at Europe's edge, almost touching Asia Minor across the water, for imperial strategy. It could serve as a bridge between the empire's European and Asian portions, across imperial halves. If fortified properly, it would control the Bosporus and the sea route to the Black Sea. Every ship from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea had to pass through this narrow gate. Also, peace with Persia was about to expire, and the eastern frontier demanded attention. But Germanic tribes on the Rhine remained a threat, so he could not move too far away. Byzantium stood near enough to the east and still reasonably connected to the west. Constantine claimed the choice was guided by God, not only by political calculation for the capital, however he explained it. The city would become one of his wisest decisions for the empire. Ancient Byzantium was too small for the emperor's dream of a new world capital. Its walls from Septimius Severus's reign were only about 2 miles long, around old Byzantium. Constantine decided to echo Rome's founding legend and walk far beyond the old limits. With a spear in hand, he marked the route where the new walls should stand. The ceremony joined Christians and pagan priests, as if the city had to speak to both worlds. When his companions wondered at the scale, they asked how far he meant to go, according to tradition. Constantine answered, "As far as the one walking before him leads." Christians understood those words as pointing to God, who was guiding the emperor through Christian hearing. Pagans could hear them as referring to another god, or the unconquered sun through pagan ears. By the ceremony's end, a vast area had been set aside for a future multitude. Construction began immediately, but local materials and skilled artisans were not enough. For imperial demands, Constantine's timetable was too demanding, and the new capital required beauty at once. For immediate grandeur, therefore, imperial agents searched across the empire for statues, columns and ornaments to furnish Constantinople. Years later, Chi-Rho would say Constantinople was dressed in the nakedness of the rest of the key. Empire's statues of pagan gods were taken from ancient temples and placed in the city's public spaces. They could be seen in the hippodrome, baths, and squares of the new capital. Thus, the ancient gods, turned into ornaments, seemed to lose their former sacred power. For pagans, it humiliated their shrines. For Constantine, it became material for new greatness. The new capital was born as a mosaic of power, faith, force, and imperial beauty. Every stone declared that the world's center no longer had to remain in old Rome. The most famous prize was a statue of Apollo, attributed to the great Phidias. It was placed in the city's center, atop a huge stone column brought from Egypt. That column was reputed to be the largest monolith of its kind in the known world. Make the monument taller. The column stood on a marble pedestal, over 20 feet high. The whole monument reached about 125 feet from base to top, but the statue was no longer truly Apollo. Its head was replaced with Constantine's head. Thus the city displayed a strange union of old pagan grandeur and new imperial identity. Nearby rose St. Irene's Basilica, the Hippodrome, public baths, and a great palace around Constantine's Forum. The few noble families moving from old Rome received replicas of their ancestral mansions. Constantine was building not only a city, but a new stage for his power and memory. But luxury and walls alone could not fill the new capital with people. Without living citizens, to attract residents, Constantine granted newcomers privileges and exemptions, making settlement more attractive and practical quickly. Some were freed from taxes, others from military service, so the city would grow faster. Soon, Constantinople's citizens commonly received free oil, wheat, and wine. His urban life expanded across districts. Thus, the city began growing with incredible speed, exceeding even its founders' bold calculations. A century later, under Theodosius II, new walls were needed because the population outgrew the old ones. What seemed excessive under Constantine proved only the beginning of the future capital within one generation. The decision to build Constantinople had consequences that would outlive the Western Empire, beyond Western collapse. When old Rome fell under barbarian pressure, the new center preserved the ancient inheritance. Thus, the city built on Byzantium became the heart of the Eastern Roman, or Byzantine, Empire. Now comes the central question: what was Constantine's conversion, and how sincere was it? Soon after these events, Christian authors began seeing him as history's intended goal, within providential history. For them, empire and church seemed always to have moved towards such a ruler. Others explained everything more simply. Constantine was a clever politician, exploiting conversion's obvious advantages for power. But both extremes oversimplify the man, and an age where religion was everywhere, inside public life. Documents from the time show his conversion differed sharply from the normal Christian path. Ordinary converts were taught discipline, faith, and a new life for a long time before baptism. A bishop became their shepherd, helping them understand how faith changed daily decisions inside ordinary life. Constantine did not walk this path as an ordinary student of the church, unlike other converts. That is why his faith became not a simple answer, but a historical mystery. Even after Milvian Bridge, Constantine did not submit himself to bishop's instruction. Despite Christian victory, Christians were in his entourage, but they did not directly govern his spiritual life. Lactantius, tutor of his son Crispus, belonged to the circle around him. Within court circles, Bishop Hosius of Cordoba served for a time as liaison with church leaders to imperial politics. But Constantine kept the right to define his own religious practices and church interventions. He even considered himself Bishop of Bishops, as supreme arbiter above difficult church disputes. After conversion, he still joined pagan rites unacceptable for ordinary Christians. During public ceremonies, bishops did not openly condemn him, because the situation was unusual and dangerous under imperial pressure. Technically, he was not yet Christian, since he received baptism only on his deathbed. Therefore, the church saw him as a patron, but not fully one of the faithful. On the other hand, seeing Constantine as a simple, cynical opportunist would also be mistaken. That view projects modern political logic into an ancient world where religion worked differently. Even skeptics of that time did not treat gods as empty instruments of publicity. If Constantine sought Christian advantage, he chose a very strange moment among pagan Romans. When he placed the Chi-Rho on the labarum, he prepared for battle over pagan Rome. His main supporters there were old aristocrats, angry at Maxentius, not Christian masses within Roman politics. Christians were stronger in the east, which Constantine would claim only years later, beyond his reach. Moreover, Christians offered him no great military or financial advantage from their communities then. Many belonged to lower classes, and the church's attitude toward military service remained complicated. After 3 centuries of tension, nobody could predict Christians' response to a patron emperor. Most likely, Constantine sincerely believed in Christ's power, but understood it in his own way. For him, the Christian God was a mighty being supporting the ruler who favored the faithful. When he built churches and issued favorable laws, he sought this God's goodwill through visible patronage. He believed this God had given him victory at the Milvian Bridge against Maxentius there. In this, he resembled Licinius, who feared the supernatural force of another man's labarum. The difference was that Constantine claimed that power by serving the Christian cause through public patronage. But this did not stop him from honoring other divine powers of the ancient world. His father honored the unconquered Son, and Constantine long saw compatibility between Son and Christ. He accepted the title of high priest, joined pagan ceremonies, and sometimes consulted Apollo. So part 1 ends with a paradox. The church's patron still stands in the old religious world. The campaign against Licinius allowed Constantine to appear not merely as conqueror, but as Christianity's defender. He was now entering lands where the church had long counted many of its strongest adherents. For these communities, Licinius's defeat could seem not only political, but also spiritual change. After victory, Constantine appointed a number of Christians to high positions in government, inside imperial offices. This changed the atmosphere of power. Church people were entering the empire's machinery itself. At the same time, tension grew with the Roman Senate, where many supported pagan revival. The more the Senate leaned toward old gods, the more Constantine leaned toward Christianity. This was not an instant rupture, but the direction of his policy grew clearer. Constantine's power now needed not only armies, but also religious meaning, beyond armed force. Thus, the victor's policy gradually became the language of a new alliance between throne and church. In 324, an imperial edict ordered all soldiers to worship the supreme god inside military ranks. This was to happen on the first day of the week, a day of symbolic tension. For Christians, it was the day when they celebrated the resurrection of their Lord. But for pagans, it was also the day of the unconquered Son, so the order did not sound foreign. Here appeared Constantine's style, a step forward, and shaped so different groups could accept it. The edict spoke of one supreme god, without naming the divisive details too. Sharply, thus soldiers could obey the order, without necessarily understanding it in the same way. For the church, it signaled support. For old cults, it was not yet direct attack. Imperial law was learning a language that joined faith with governmental order, through imperial discipline. But the more law touched worship, the closer a new age of church politics came. A year after the edict, in 325, the emperor called a great assembly of bishops. Later, it would be known as the First Ecumenical Council, gathered in Nicaea under imperial summons. The very calling showed a new reality. The emperor now intervened in church affairs. He again placed the imperial posting system at the service of bishops traveling to council. What once belonged to state administration now helped an assembly of the church for episcopal travel. For many believers, this could look miraculous after the recent age of persecution and imperial terror. Yet inside this miracle hid a question. Who would guide the church from now on? The bishops gathered to discuss faith, but their journey was carried by imperial power. Thus, Nicaea became not only a theological event, but a turning point between power and church. And that line will lead us to new questions in the second part of the story. The founding of Constantinople became another step in that same direction of religious policy. Creating a new Rome meant reducing the influence of old Rome's ancient aristocratic families. Most of those families remained pagan, and were attached to old temples and customs. The new capital allowed the emperor to build power without daily pressure from their memory, even moving ornaments from pagan temples struck at old centers of devotion for Constantine's city. Local shrines lost gods that had been objects of popular devotion for generations through imperial removal. For the new capital, this was beauty, but for many cities, it was loss and fear. Even some Christian writers admitted this was done through excessive force against sacred places. People often complied not from conviction, but because they feared imperial punishment under armed supervision. Thus, building the city became both creation of new power and dismantling of an older world. Against the background of removed pagan treasures, new Christian buildings looked especially striking around new churches. Churches appeared in the city, showing whom imperial power now favored. Across public space, the Basilica of St. Irene, Holy Peace, became one symbol of the new capital. But this was not only piety, it was a public statement about a new hierarchy. Old gods became decorations, while Christian places received fresh stone and gold under Constantine's patronage. This contrast could not remain unnoticed by either Christians or pagans inside the city. For some, it meant the end of humiliation. For others, the beginning of their own loss. That is why Constantine's era was not a simple story of liberation without consequences. In the very moment of victory, future disputes about power, faith, and coercion were being born. The new order promised safety, but also placed the church beside dangerous power, beside imperial authority. It is important to see that Constantine did not destroy paganism with one sudden decree. The ancient gods were too deeply rooted in the army, villages, and educated circles. Athens and Alexandria still preserved the prestige of old pagan wisdom and learning. Within educated culture, one imperial command could not immediately undo this enormous inheritance across armies, villages, schools, and temples. Moreover, Constantine himself long saw no complete contradiction between old and new within his mind. Therefore, his policy moved slowly but steadily, answering both reality and his inner development. First, he ended persecution and ordered confiscated Christian property returned to its local communities again. Then came new signs of favor, increasingly visible and practically useful, through imperial favor. Yet he still tried to maintain relations with those who followed ancient religions, across religious boundaries. Thus, the empire crossed not by a cliff, but by a long and ambiguous bridge. The empire's official religion still remained paganism, even while Christians received support through legal continuity. As head of state, Constantine accepted the title of Supreme Pontiff, or High Priest. He performed duties connected with that title, preserving a link with the ancient system. Even on coins minted around 320, symbols of the old gods could still be found. On those same coins appeared the Chi-Rho, first used by him at Milvian Bridge. One empire, one minting, yet two religious universes still stood side by side within imperial coinage. This small detail reveals Constantine's religious ambiguity more clearly than many later speeches ever could. He favored the church, but did not immediately sever every thread with the old world. This duality made his figure so influential and also so controversial among later Christians. In him, the church saw a protector, while history saw the beginning of a very complex age. Almost until his death, Constantine continued functioning as the high priest of paganism within Roman religion. After his death, his sons did not oppose the Senate's move to declare him a god. Thus came a striking irony. The patron of Christianity became one of the pagan gods, and at the same time, the Eastern Church would honor him as a saint. One man became both saint and pagan god, a startling symbol of a transitional age. But something else mattered even more. His policy permanently changed the church's position inside church history. A recently persecuted community now received support. Property, roads, buildings, and access to power. This rescued Christians from fear, but placed before them entirely new temptations for their future. The question was no longer only how the church survived persecution. After imperial favor, Now the question is, what happens when the persecuted church stands beside imperial power?